Out of all the game modes in Skullgirls Mobile, Rift Battles is by far the most competitive, difficult and divisive game mode on the entire game. Compared to prize fights, dailies and story mode, Rift Battles require some thought to plan the most ideal offense and set the best defense possible. Every player has a base with a total of 6 nodes, each with a preset modifier that changes every week. You must set a variant for defense for each node slot, and ideally fill it with catalysts, extra modifiers to further increase the defense's effectiveness. Once completed, other people will be capable of facing off against it, and you'll also have access to deal with theirs. Finishing with a high score is what you must strive for. If your score is low, the opponent may consider to directly go after your base and claim his score back plus extra points. Unlike prize fights where the score would resemble your average arcade system, Rift Battles follows an ELO system instead, which will reset to 1000 points every week. These are some of the cracks of what makes Rift so competitive. The fact that your actions will more directly influence others and can potentially have an eventual blowback should you either score low or face off against a very skilled player or a hacker. But it certainly has seen a lot of changes over the years on how it's played and structured as a whole, and it hasn't been short of controversy up to its current state. As such, we'll go through the several stages of Rifts up to where we are now, and why the community seems to heavily criticize it. The origin of Rift Battles can be traced back to December 2018, with the release of the 3.0 patch. The concept behind Rifts was to have 2 players face off against each other, but rather than having it as a direct match unlike PvP, instead it asks you to build a base to prevent the opponent from scoring high, and you must go after whatever your rival had in store. Both of you would have a total of 2 hours to finish the opponent's base, and at the end, whoever had the highest score wins. The biggest difference between the old and current Rift, instead of 6 nodes total, the old format featured 10. The nodes were stationary and several modifiers were easy and straightforward. Although the biggest obstacle was by far the boss node, with the modifier Sacrosanct, which would reflect any debuff applied to the opponent back at the player if this wasn't an element penalty. That made the boss incredibly hard to take care of, which issued a quick patch where they changed penalty to bonus. The most dominant defensive archetypes would usually involve the likes of Valentine with variants such as Last Hope, Surgeon General, and Assassin's Creed, big bands like Resonant Evil, Private Dick, and Heavy Metal, and other defenders like Dreadlocks. This was facilitated with a great health and recovery that led to significant durability and made for hard approaches. It's worth noting, however, that the natural diamond variants would take a while to fully catch up due to being released the same patch as Rifts. Offensively, Xenomorph was by far the most dominant, with her access to Doom allowing her to instantly defeat anything, and her Chaos Marquee for good measure. It was slow but generally consistent. Other options would involve the likes of Prime and Harlequin for hard-hitting duties. Summer Salt in particular would eventually become one of the most dominant variants on the offensive side, thanks to her buff removal and chip damage. Now, while there were clear dominant variants, the early Rift meta would take time to develop, as the bases were considerably large, and not everyone could fit them with well-suited defenders. So it wasn't uncommon to see stuff like Wolfspin or Buzzkill lying around some bases. And a similar case would befall offense, since not every variant would become a desirable attacker, or for most cases not instantly anyway. The scoring system was significantly different. For instance, having a character death would massively affect your overall score, so healing supports were not only a great option, but a necessity. The combo bonus would depend only if you had a 20+ combo chain. Not surpassing it would result in no points for that bonus. And most important would be the end of battle bonuses. Most noticeable would be defender diversity, as they would try to prevent duplicate defenders by penalizing multiple of the same variant. Also, if your defense was effective enough to creep the opponent, you'd gain extra points as a result. On patch 3.1, significant changes would be made to the Rift nodes, but for the most part, the mode itself would remain untouched. Unlike the previous patch, which allowed you to reuse variants indefinitely at the cost of Theonite, you now could only use them twice per Rift, where a second use of anything would result in missing 250 points per variant reused. Additionally, top combo scores would be based on the highest combo landed, up to 50 maximum, and no deaths will be reduced from 500 points to 250, making the penalty of missing it much less severe. But this wasn't as major compared to the following change in replacing several nodes with different modifiers. By far the most notable changes were biofeedback replacing perfect block, transducer over instant replay, and especially house advantage taking sacrosanct's spot. This one change certainly made it easier on the player base, as now there was much more freedom to go with the debuff based strategies. However, house advantage would still prove a tricky modifier, primarily because of like type Valentines being considerably effective for stalling, and dreadlocks adding furthermore pressure. As such, it was still rather important to keep elements in mind when entering the boss. For the most part, these changes were small, and this scoring and base format would persist for the rest of the first iteration of Rifts. But this was only a taste of things to come. Catalysts were a massive change to Rifts, as they intended to apply extra modifiers to a node chosen by the player, making it so that each base would feel much more unique in general. The initial reactions, I'm positive they welcomed this change with open arms. Seriously though, during the early days people would form a lot of negative expectations, and most of them would end up being met. There are bronze, silver and gold tiers, and naturally only gold ones would become used by high level players, as no silver or bronze catalysts were able to contribute anything that gold already did. Also, there are character specific versions, increasing their effectiveness at the cost of only working for whoever it was specified. Early on, a very select few of them would rise to the top, while the rest would be rendered completely useless. Most notable of these were Autoimmune becoming an excellent counter to debuff-based strategies, and lasting for a respectable 15 seconds maximum. Into Thin Air, Blockbusted and Super Slow-Mo all made for outstanding blockbuster control, a feature that generally was missing on previous patches and could very poorly be done by a couple variants. By far, Blockbusted proved and still proves to be the dominant one, as it had both a long-lasting debuff and very high odds of activating, reaching 100% if it was character specific. It was better than Super Slow-Mo due to being outrageously consistent, and unlike Into Thin Air, it wasn't tied to an element restriction. Thus, Blockbusted instantly rose to the top of finisher control. Frost Armor and Don't Poke the Bure work as outstanding reflect damage options, the latter gaining special notice for making Painless much more viable for defense, since you couldn't command grab your way to victory anymore to avoid any potential Tainted Blood defender. And last words will be the crown jewel for like-type defenses, increasing further their stall capabilities and forcing buff removal of any kind. But you can't talk about early catalysts without discussing by far the two most dominant catalysts that when paired together would lead to considerable mayhem. I'm talking of course about armor rating and futile resistance.
You can't hurt me, Jack!
Armor rating operated like its current form, except without a combo cap. This made it so the opponent could very much gain an armor stack and negate damage on the very first few hits. Seeing this one catalyst equipped anywhere would basically increase the difficulty tenfold, as your attacks would be arbitrarily ignored. And this paired incredibly well with Futile Resistance, which would deal up to 6% instant damage if Big Ben suffered less than 1% on a hit. This coupled with his high defenses, variants like Resident Evil and Heavy Metal who can further increase their defenses by gaining armor, being paired with armor rating and a third catalyst of your choosing, Autoimmune being generally preferred, and this made for one of the most difficult nodes to deal with in the game and would issue several nerfs for it to be much more bearable to deal with.
Frustrated, guys. You have no fucking clue. I wish I could just make you feel how I feel, because I want to punch a hole through a fucking
concrete wall.
In summation, while the addition of catalysts had good intentions to spice up the gameplay, it was fated to have many of them being useless, while a select few would become meta-centric. It also was absurdly blatant how unbalanced and broken most of these were, but thankfully a balancing patch would drop with 3.3. As everyone expected and really wanted to see, your boy armor rating indeed got nerfed with the next patch. It now required a 10 combo count for it to activate, allowing for much more stress-free fights. Blockbusted and Into Thin Air would also be toned down, so they would be much more easy to deal with, allowing for some much needed breathing room when it came to blockbuster finishers. Another feature was also touched on the patch with catalysts, that being matchmaking. Its first iteration was exclusively based around your score, so being around 1800 would match you with players at a similar Rift rating. The new matchmaking takes collection strength into consideration, about your 20 strongest variants. This was a rather unpopular change, which was clearly aimed at lower level players, but it made progression for others much more difficult, since you would always have to face off against higher level players. Sure, it could be potentially annoying for newcomers to find someone that decided to stop playing for a couple of weeks, but climbing as a result became a ridiculous chore, and poor collection players could easily skip the ones with Diamond 1 levels, because they would keep on matching gold and below. Thankfully, this would be fairly addressed on the same patch as the one where catalysts were adjusted, so at least you would have to try for a high rank. And several other matters will be addressed on the following patches, specifically stats and moves.
Alright, you're a narcissist? You're a sociopath? You're probably a psychopath. You're a...
There's been a big elephant in the room throughout this video. Nowadays, big bands and some Valentines make for poor defenders. But as previously stated, they were considerable threats. What happened? At its core, it all lies within the stat change.
Buckle the fuck up, little doggy.
During the caveman times, there were 5 separate debuff resistance stats. Those 5 resistances were bleed, armor break, disables, stun and... Can take this shit seriously, man. They were incredibly situational, even though bleed and armor break could be of help as a counter for Phileas bleeds and Cerebella's armor break. Well-invested defenders proved to be incredibly difficult to beat. As such, all these situational resistances will be replaced with more practical stuff. Special attack cooldown will reduce the reload time of these assets, resistance allowed to resist any debuff and not just a small selection of them. Accuracy would serve as a counter to resistance, and increases the odds of percentage-based abilities. And most important would be piercing. By far this would become one of the most important stats for attackers, as they would be able to bypass a certain amount of defense, thus making it incredibly easier to fight defenses. As a result, big bends will be rendered less practical, since piercing would allow most low combo hard hitters to easily deal more than 1% damage, and this wouldn't be helped by the nerf to futile resistance, now only working while above 50% HP. To add insult to injury, the armor buff was also nerfed from 25% down to 20%, which would reduce the proficiency of the likes of Resident Evil and Heavy Metal. The biggest victims of the stat change would be Private Dick and Ultra Violent, variants with abilities that would basically become universal stats, thus being left unimpressive and obsolete. With time, Frost Armor would rise up as the most dominant catalyst, thanks to the likes of Blue Screen and the recently added Plot Twisted. The latter especially would combine excellent with Return to Sender and popularize this archetype, along with the likes of Dead of Winter. Last Word nodes would remain relevant even if it took a bit of a beating with the piercing implementation. Don't Poke the Bureau nodes would also be gifted Neuromancer, a variant that thanks to her absurdly quick meter gain should create a large amount of pressure on the player, forcing them to act quickly. On the offensive side, X-Watt would become a versatile variant with high recovery and damage output, but wouldn't become instantly popular due to being judged beforehand as lesser overclocked. And Parasol in general would gain a new asset in a buffed Egret Call. The same patch that changed stats would also drop several changes for specials and blockbusters. Egret Call would become the most relevant, as instead of Enrage, she would now gain precision stacks, massively benefiting from the critical mass marquee. Eliza would also be considerably buffed, as her Burst and Sekhmet's Bite now had access to Curse, making for further buff control. And with the stat changes, Standout would gain much more attention as an outstanding buff controller.
You're a waste of space on this earth.
As a whole, 4.0 could be considered as the patch that changed the game as we knew it. Its patches weren't outright directed exclusively at Rifts, but they would massively impact its mechanics and what would become a good defense and countermeasure going forward. For sure, it marked the steadier rise of characters such as Eliza, and would boost Parasol as the primary tool for the vast majority of the Rift meta, or even the entire game as a whole. But with time, the game would end up growing stale within the player base, as for a long time the same tools would be used everywhere with very little variety. This wasn't helped by the static design of the Rift modifiers, and the constant need of play to prevent score decay. As such, it was both tedious and somewhat stressful, and people would frequently try matching with each other to intentionally aim for a draw to not lose points on either side, but also counting as a completed match in the process. The way Hidden Variable thought of addressing this was to revamp the whole game mode for a more casual audience, a bold move from the company, but during its first months, it would pay off.
Hostia tío, que no lo he enchufado.
Asynchronous battles was the main selling point of the officially dubbed Rift Battles 2.0, as it was determined to replace the previous matching methods, where instead of you and your opponent facing off against each other at the same time, you would instead be presented a list of 3 opponents to choose upon, and you would be able to attack them at any moment desired. Then they'll have a revenge available in case they wish to claim their points back. In the case you prefer to be presented a different selection of enemies, you can refresh for free every 2 hours. On the surface, Rift 2.0 takes a lot of inspiration of prize fights, with its HUD and options resembling it a fair amount. And by far a big addition was removing timers, meaning you could spend up to 3 days on a base if you wish, for whatever reason. In terms of revenges, they used to prove rather unnecessary in the beginning, because you were claiming your points back, but exclusively your points back. That made it so there would be higher worth in attacking somebody else instead of focusing on pointless revenges, since at the end of the day, both were about the same score. This would change on the next patch, where revenges were given actual worth by not only claiming back your points, but also taking additional ones from the opponent who attacked you beforehand. As such, far more emphasis was put on gameplay as clean as possible, so you wouldn't receive a sudden score drop whiplash. Another big selling point is the new compressed base size and its rotational effects determined by the elemental prize fight to be held on the week. For the most part, it manages to make the mode a bit fresher, having a total of 30 modifiers spread around 6 nodes a week. That's a lot of gameplay changes, having to maneuver through several modifiers, but it would take a few months for it to eventually grow stale regardless, mostly due to a low need of switching your base to best fit the weekly modifiers. Granted, it can still give occasional advantage if you choose to aim for it, the best example being the concrete result node in my opinion, but for most people it ended up proving unnecessary. Additionally, most modifiers are easily ignored, such as power of 2 and juiced up, but evened out with more complex ones such as off tempo and punch through. Next up is the streak bonuses. Keeping up a chain of consecutive victories will earn you attack and health bonuses for added durability and slight extra horsepower to your variants, up to 30% maximum each. It comes in handy when needing to deal with the harder threats, although it had rough beginnings, only lasting about 12 hours total. Then it would reset back to 0. This would be changed up to 24, so people didn't need to rush Rift to preserve the streak bonuses. A choice objectively well received. And these are the bases of the system currently in place. Now let us get started on the current metagame and how to get around most of the meta obstacles.
Es hora de trabajar. Venga.
¡Hostia puta!
For the most part, the metagame of Rift 2.0 would remain the same compared to the Rift 1.0. The usual catalyst and variant archetypes would get used to the new modifiers and its rotation schedule, although more often than not, the bulk of the challenge will still come from the variant and catalyst selection, and occasionally a potentially annoying modifier like double tap. The two characters to noticeably rise in popularity were Philia and Double, who had their respective markers buffed, Leech for superior offense self-recovery, and Volatility with increased random buff frequency for defense. So let's take a look at the catalysts on the current meta, the variants that fit into it, and what manages to stick around, what doesn't work, and how to deal with it. Now to make things faster, I'll be only reviewing the gold rarity and general version of catalysts, excluding bronze and silver rarities and character locked versions. In short, the former has cheaper costs but worse effects, making them almost undesirable with a few exceptions, while the latter is restricted to the character indicated on the catalyst. But its effect is vastly increased, making it usually preferred for single character oriented nodes. Also, I won't review every single one individually, since it will prove a waste of time. As such, I have chosen to group most of them by similar activation conditions or potential scenarios. To start off, we'll go with what I label as the worst type of catalyst, offense-based. These involve hitting the player or powering up in attack within ranges or similar, to then dish out as much damage as possible. In general, assuming the player will get hit is a poor decision. You can't allow yourself to underestimate whoever attacks you. The only exception to this would arguably be Overload, due to the added risk of a potential stun, but even then it's still not too great. Also, to be precise, could be added to the mix, but I'll get into it later. This may come off as bizarre, as most of these catalysts either help or involve tier 3 blockbusters, which in concept is good, but the problem is that they're generally outclassed, and meter control proves to be a very effective method against it. Mega Elixir would be the considerably better one due to mixing well with Valentine's regeneration, although it was definitely better during the old stats period. Two sides of the same coin, Regeneration X and Bleeding Guilty both extend either regeneration or bleed. Good on paper, very inefficient in execution, as both have overall underwhelming effects on the long term of battle. Plus, consider Valentine's ICU. By itself, 20 seconds is already a lengthy time, so Regeneration X is only redundant as a result. The AI blocking a hit is more likely than it landing hits on the player, but regardless, the catalysts at hand don't particularly have good effects, either because they're underwhelming or too convoluted. At least Shot in the Dark works as a Neuromancer counter of sorts, but it still won't prove too much of a problem when you can either use immunity support or just another character. While less effective than its big brother Frost Armor, especially High Waters, some of these catalysts can occasionally do decent, as they force some sort of armor control. Despite its nerfs, armor rating still holds a shred of relevancy, as it usually discourages high count combos, even though it's more of a small annoyance rather than a large threat. As for Cripple Decker, it's conceptually good, but fails on the fact that Cripple has very little effectiveness at damage reduction. Recovery is often important in Rifts to secure a high score, as such some catalysts are dedicated to hindering it, but most of the time they meet with poor results or can be bypassed depending on your approach. Hell, Hollow Points directly contributes to Valentine's ICU. If anything, it ends up working on the player's favor rather than against it. Most of these just prove as noble concepts rather than effective, as there is potential on disabling either specials or tag-ins, but more often than not prove gimmicky. Don't get me wrong, the idea of fucking with specials sounds interesting to prevent taunts and the like, but its activation is poor and can be easily bypassed with a Persoal tag-in for example, and you know why I mentioned her specifically. Also, Wither Forecast is just worse super slow-mo. The biggest problem with this character catalyst often boils down to either having a very weak effect for the variants to make full use of, or they can be decent but lack a considerable set of defenders to get the most of them, some cases both things. Arguably the better one would be Great Escape due to evasion being a decent pace breaker, but only Dreadlocks and to a very lesser extent the Diamond Phileas can put it to good use. Still, it can get bypassed regardless by either heavy combos or Curse. Throughout patches, some catalysts were toned down from their far more oppressive forms. Autoimmune and Futile Resistance were clear dominants in the early days, but were severely gutted and now are passable at best. As for Hexitime, it was just a matter of the meta evolving past the point it's a major threat. Now it's only become a minor annoyance, mostly decent against attackers that may rely on their abilities a lot. The one that's still considered passable enough is Into Thin Air for being an instant blockbuster wipe, but it's limited for having very few good air defenders. We're headed into the most common archetypes found in Rifts, and kicking off this segment, we have decent stall tactics in Lightweight and Invincible Armada. They both focus on wasting as much time as possible by either not reacting to hits or taking no damage for a couple seconds, but both share a weakness on being vulnerable to buff removal. It does force the buff removal if the player wishes to move along, and for that it's every now and again used. Invincible Armada usually works best on the air weak boss, thanks to Double Tap, allowing it to be activated much more often. By itself, Super Slow-Mo is a good meter control option, but doesn't compare to Blockbuster's effectiveness. However, it would become the best pairing with Scratching Post, as it would contribute to its stun capabilities, especially Super Slow-Mo is fortune specific. It's an archetype that either forces the player to carry immunity support, or alternatively intercept as much as possible, preferably with Silent Kill, who can benefit from ICU at the same time. Its weaknesses lie on being very easy to figure out and counter, and Misfortune not having very good defenders, with a few still average exceptions. Another popular character archetype consists on Robo Fortune nodes equipped with Electrostatic Field and To Be Precise. While both possess synergy as the latter facilitates the activation of the former, the reason To Be Precise is utilized is because of Overclock's ability of any hit becoming unblockable at 3 precision stacks. As such, the pressure is built up, as you need to stay clear from any potential unblockable hit, more so when adding up Robo's beams into the mix. But with time, the solution was not just limited to buff control, since you can simply carry a hard hitter of your choice and try to beat down overclock before she gets a chance of anything. Both methods combined is preferred, but in conclusion, this strategy nowadays is a decent but underwhelming gimmick. Blockbuster and Final Fight are the best the game has to offer in control for blockbusters. Both have different approaches, as one forces constant immunity to prevent any disabling, while the other asks for means of either curse or buff removal in order to bypass or prevent it. Out of the two, Blockbuster is generally the best as it fits almost everything, but Final Fight can find its best strength on double nodes, for example, often consisting of Immortal Fiber and Evergreen Evil. Of course, combining the two can provide superior blockbuster control, but it comes at the cost of missing out on a different coverage. Curse of Knowledge is tasked with the prevention of buff support from the likes of Surgeon General, or if possible, Parasol's immunity and precision. It relies on the AI gaining buffs, so having variants gain them by any means like abilities, modifiers or other catalysts will match greatly. It's often seen with the previously mentioned double nodes, thanks to the volatility marquee serving as the activation method. By itself it can do great, but more often than not it has to rely on whatever there's on the defense. Ever since its release, Frost Armor has been a mainstay in the meta, with very little changes to how it works. While the AI has any armor stack, they'll also reflect damage back at the player, making a head-on brute force approach incredibly unviable, as you'll never not activate it. Common counters for this involve buff removal tools, the likes of Standout and Somersault being the most effective, and usually recommended against defenders such as Model Leader and Plot Twisted. Using Curse also works, but it's not encouraged due to variants usually carrying resistance. Don't Poke the Bear is also a notorious reflect damage tool, putting Painwheel's poor base defense capabilities to actual good use, as dealing above 10% of her health will be reflected back at the player. This, further supported with the Tainted Blood marquee, will make for some considerable reflect damage, and furthermore pressure is added with a beast known as Neuromancer on the defensive side. To make it out with as much health as possible, it's common on high level play to avoid investing crit rate on the skill trees for barons with regeneration capabilities, such as Bioexorcist or Diva Intervention. It isn't mandatory, but it can make a noticeable difference score-wise. Both Last Words and Return to Sender share something in common, this being they're rather limited as to who are the most ideal choices for. Last Words was a very strong stall tactic, but after the stat change it took a heavy hit. Nowadays it's rather easy to either curse beforehand or remove the final stand. Still, it's kept alive thanks to the light element having quite competent defenders in Dreadlocks and Splitting Image. Return to Sender is a similar case, as very few Squigglies will ever force the player to debuff them, thus avoiding the catalyst activation. Only about 2 make the most of it, Dead of Winter and Plot Twisted, thanks to the water typing and compatibility with Frost Armor. Furthermore, Plot Twisted will always trigger Return to Sender because of her ability, and reflect her 5 debuffs at the player. As a result, Somersault is the prime counter because of both immunity, precision and buff removal access. And that would be all there really is to the main metagame. Heavy focus on buff and blockbuster finisher prevention is generally the most desirable, paired with either methods of added stall or reflect damage. And on the offense side, you always want to have some sort of immunity and buff removal as an effective counter. But why has the meta become like this? Over time, Rift Battles have become a far more tedious game mode where a lot of people ended giving up on it due to lacking any retention of interest. How did this happen? What led to the problems of Rift Battles? While it's true that you're only asked to play about 5 matches, the quota for a diamond rank increases up to 15 to 20 matches in total. Gold 1 can be easily secured this way, and it houses decent enough rewards, but if your target is diamond 4 or further, it becomes a larger chore. While these matches last about 8 to 10 minutes total and can be easily distributed throughout a week, they more often than not present themselves as unengaging, and that's because of the matchmaking in place. The way matches are presented is by having you pair with people carrying close rift scores. The problem with this will be that you will inevitably have to steamroll a lot of low-level people to climb up the ladder. For a seasoned player, this will be displayed as a chain of unengaging, low-difficulty matches before they can find much more difficult and interesting opponents. On the opposite side of the spectrum, new players that try to climb upwards may inevitably find themselves being beaten by several high-level players, with no chance of retaliation. An issue that, ironically enough, Hidden very well would try to fix in 1.0 and is sort of present here. Defender diversity was a score criteria present in 1.0. Its purpose was to limit the amount of defender duplicates a player could slot in a base. That way they wouldn't fully get away with a triple plot twisted or immoral fiber, for example. That criteria is now gone, and in its place there's basically nothing. Nowadays people can simply get away with having multiple copies of the same overly effective defender. A restriction of sorts has been heavily requested by the community. An example being reducing the match modifier's strength. In addition to defense, people would also be interested on seeing an offense diversity of sorts, so that people can simply rely on multiple copies of the same attacker for different nodes. One of Rift 1.0's strengths was that since people would play less Rifts, that meant they had less practice with certain catalysts, such as scratching post, thus making them slightly more challenging. But now, with a much more spam-based format, everyone has gotten used to everything at this point. That's not to say it won't catch off guard people every now and again, but the counters have been more than figured out. It's also not helped by the fact that the set of catalysts available have been out for a very long time with very little new additions. Some of the bugs on the game managed to find their way on Rifts, although it applies as well on prize fights and the like, but it's at its most notorious here. For example, a cursed blue screen can be killed in midair and prevent her explosion, negating any need of timing. A lot of these exploits have been already heavily figured out, and they're also commonly utilized, so in terms of a fair play, they're bugs that should require patching as soon as possible. The player base ended up getting tired by the overall repetitive nature of Rifts, and just quit the game mode, or some cases the game itself. This isn't something outright easy to patch due to the mode and game being structured as a repetitive grind, with little to no deviation on its setup. Hell, it's also a valid argument as to why Rift 1.0 failed. People got tired of the mode because even with a string of additions it was the same thing every time, leading to a revamp issued and then released. It's also fair to say the endgame as a whole has very little to offer. We do meme a lot about guilds not coming out, but in a way it speaks volumes of the lack of game modes to hold most veterans' interests. As such, the future of Rift battles feels a bit uncertain. It still holds enough interest due to possessing excellent rewards in shards and diamond keys, but the recently added diamond prize fights hold these very same rewards as well. The best we can do now is speculate and hope for good changes. And that is the beginning and present day of Rift battles. Throughout its course, it has seen a bumpy ride to say the least. It's a concept with a lot of promise, since there's appeal on attacking other people in a direct fashion. But at its core, the mode itself has flaws that hold it back on drawing its full potential at becoming a great mode worth the effort. It's the game mode that has seen the most changes so far, and a small competitive scene where everyone wants to claw in for a sweet diamond rank. But more and more, the effort needed for it feels less worth it, and as such, it's questionable if one should go for high rankings or simply to 5 matches for a quick reward and call it a day. By the time of editing this, the new dupe system hasn't been revealed yet, but it's uncertain if when released it will have a large impact. In some respects, it gives off the same vibes than the Catalyst release, potentially making the game pay to win, but hopefully that won't happen. In conclusion, just say fuck it and showcase the new Toyo decision to the audience. Works every time.
I don't give a shit!